All right, so personally identifiable information. This is another really critical thing that we want to think about when selecting from files because the ease of saving information as digital files, the portability of digital files, and the general desire to just store stuff in the digital land has resulted in a proliferation of the kinds of personally identifiable information that we put on digital carriers. And now I've said this a couple of times, but um, what is PII? So PII is information that helps identify or otherwise represent somebody. And classic examples of this include things like social security numbers or credit card numbers. But it can also include things like tax records or medical information or traces of online activity like search histories and web caches. All this stuff is like things that could be used to assume somebody's identity, to find out information that they don't want to make public. It can be potentially dangerous information. So, how do we figure out where this stuff is, and then what do we do when we figure out? Well, finding files with this information requires a variety of approaches. Sometimes a specific file format is a good indicator. We talked about DICOM, and yeah, things like a DICOM image format or a TurboTax tax return file format tell you that, hey, this probably contains information that I don't really care about unless I'm running a medical archive or a financial information archive or something like that. So yeah, these are things that you look at the file format and you can say, okay, I don't really want to get that kind of stuff. However, there are other things that you can't just use the file format. You have to actually understand some of the stuff inside of the file. So, for example, many modern cameras embed GPS information into photographs and videos. And this is a useful feature for photo organization. It can also lead to cool visualizations. Like here we have drone footage that has a GPS track of where the drone is at any given point. So you can have both the video and then a satellite imagery tracking where that video was shot. And you can match those things together. However, it's also potentially a mechanism that you can reveal the physical location of documents that might create problems for the original creator. So, if somebody is involved in politics and documenting human rights abuses or immigration statuses of people or things like that, it might not be the thing that you want to be disclosing those location pieces of data. So, the thing about GPS coordinates is that they're a very specific pattern, and formats like JPEG or MP4 and things like that actually encode those coordinates as ASCII text within the format. So it is possible to run a tool to scan the bytes of a file for those patterns and then report when it's found. The question, as always, is what do you do when you find it? Depending on who you are as an organization, you might say, great, this is actually metadata that we want to use for our descriptions, or this is harmful and we want to redact it, or oh, depending on the collection, we have a different answer for this. Now, I'm just going to point out as an extreme example a very large organization that works with a lot of images, which is Imager. Um, by default, they strip out every single piece of potential PII in an image file that you upload. They have way too many users, and their users that are uploading images are involved in way too many activities that there is a potentially huge liability that somebody uploads something without realizing that a photo reveals a lot more information than just what's depicted on the screen and potential real life consequences happening to that person. However, for a smaller organization that only has reading room access to files, the liability of retaining that data may be less than the effort that it actually takes to remove those pieces of information. So this is always a back and forth of how much is it worth doing these things to these files, and what is the best protection that we can do given the resources that we have. Now, another thing to think about when it comes to computers and PII is that they retain traces of how we use them, like how we play music out of a music library, how we browse the internet, and all that information is retained. And if you retain like an entire disk image, that means that you're retaining all of that potential personal or embarrassing information. And that's always an interesting thing to think about when you say preservation means retaining it all. Well, ethically, maybe you don't want to do that. Computers also retain traces of what other people have sent us. Really great example of this is when Jeb Bush released his Florida gubernatorial emails in 2015. They were filled with messages where people were petitioning for help, and they would very helpfully provide their social security number and other personal information in hopes that that could help their case. While the average person might not have the same problem as Jeb Bush here, their job may result in them having medical information, educational, financial, legal, and other records of other people on their computer. And most likely, those records are going to be just intermixed with other things. They aren't going to be just in the special folder that is going to say, like, yes, here's PII of other people. So it's another thing that you have to be very wary of when working with this kind of stuff. Finally, I do want to point out that, if you're doing complete forensic disk imaging, you do have the ability to recover deleted files. So that's partially because when you delete a file, a computer is pretty lazy and it doesn't actually delete the bytes. It doesn't go in there and it knocks them out. What it does is it just erases the entry in the file system. The bytes are still on the disk itself. So you see at the bottom there, the diagram hasn't changed, even if our file system table has. And so what happens is, okay, great, those bytes still exist. If we write a new file, potentially that new file starts occupying some of the same space. But you'll notice that box 41 and 46 haven't changed because that new file was shorter. And so those files, the end of the old file, still exists there. And if you have the right tools, you can recover that kind of data. Now, do you want to do that? Most likely no. Most likely you only really want to do that in a law enforcement setting or something like that where you want to, have evidence against somebody of files that they deleted. But you still have those abilities, and that means that if you're not careful with your data, you're granting somebody else those abilities. And there are some ethical questions behind that. So personally identifiable information is one of the harder problems when you're dealing with born digital materials, and probably one of the reasons why they will never be quite as accessible as other kinds of digital collections, because we are not making the files from scratch. We're not recording something that everybody agreed to be a part of. We're just taking files that were created in a very common and probably personal context and hoping that they don't have personal information that would be embarrassing or troubling or even harmful to have available for somebody else to look at. And we shouldn't just hope. We need to take some responsibility in that question.